Well, I'm so happy to have Anita Say Chan on the podcast. We've started this new season where we're talking about things that happen behind the scenes in the humanities, especially. And we've talked about data, we've talked about AI, and this is a perfect time to have Anita on to talk about her new book, Predatory Data, Eugenics in Big Tech, and Our Fight for an Independent Future. It's out by, published by University of California Press. I'll get it right. I swear I'll get it right. And it's also open access. So I'm going to give everyone a link to the book as well, because you must read this book. Anita, thank you for being on.
Thank you for having me, John.
See, I'm already tripping up on my words. I said I was probably going to have to edit something out, but I'm going to leave that in. It makes it more real. So, Anita, I'm going to start off with the most basic question. When someone sees the title of your book, what is predatory data?
Well, it is the form of essentially that we're living through it right now. But in many ways, what the book was written for was to underscore how the uses of predatory data are not just something that we're seeing in terms of the kinds of ways that big tech companies and the leadership of those companies have been literally weaponizing data through the kind of massive monitoring and surveillance architectures that they've built out, but also in the way that they approach technology and the everyday data platforms that we're using nowadays as these kinds of essentially the largest infrastructures for real-time experimentation on human populations at a global scale. So if we're living through it now, but the book is also a reminder that the kinds of radical data activists and architects that we're seeing with this kind of what I call techno-eugenic sort of movement that's defined Silicon Valley is not the first time we're seeing this sort of move. That this dates back over a century ago with the eugenics movement. And then, too, we saw a whole movement for quite elite men of science who were really using their elite role as men of science to remake national governments and to essentially use their stature as men who had access to troves of data and were also bent on creating ever larger architectures and schemes for monitoring human populations, essentially to argue that we needed to have a means to figure out and identify who the well-born were from the not well-born and to stratify those populations and to segregate, ideally, those populations. And in the U.S., American eugenicists were so successful that they managed to remake immigration laws, essentially to filter out, supposedly, unwanted populations, to privilege Nordic races. This was a deeply racialized, not just hierarchical, but deeply racialized project. And they effectively, American eugenicists also by the 1920s had passed in over 30 US states pro-eugenic laws to enable the legal forced sterilization of supposedly unfit populations. These were folks who would have been people that would have been in state custody, in hospitals, jails, or other kinds of state institutions, who eugenicists argued the state of them being in state institutions was evidence of their mental, moral, or physical unfitness, and therefore they should not have. It would be a danger to the rest of the society if we allowed them to continue to populate and procreate.
I saw a lot of overlap with the eugenics movement and some of the things that we hear today from the history mindset. Me as a historian, going into sometimes classrooms, I taught at university level for a little while, and hearing some people who would hear about my work and say, well, that's not our history. That's not the right history to be talking about. And I'd say, who's our? Who are we talking about? And it really seemed like there was this kind of purity kind of test with whose history are you talking about now and whose history are you trying to disseminate online and digital platforms and such, and being flagged sometimes for posting certain things in certain ways because of it being something that maybe someone, a moderator, didn't like, or something to that effect. It seems like there's some overlap with that as well, Anita, where we're seeing some kind of eugenic kind of, I don't know, force of nature, if you will, in the way we even talk about people who talk about the past.
Oh, interesting. I mean, I do think that there is now a means, a kind of attempt to cleanse history and to purify, quote unquote, purify a history so that it is a kind of convenient history for the winners. Let's say that critical history gets excised, that anything that talks about um, the kind of need for diversity, inclusion, accessibility policies, all of those things suddenly get removed as not being the quote unquote right kind of history. That the only form of history that we have is a kind of history that only celebrates the winners and maintains a certain kind of hierarchy as a status quo. It's a deeply, deeply dangerous kind of path to go down. Obviously, we can already see in any number of different, I mean, daily statements that the current administration in the U.S. Is making, but it's dangerous. It's even more dangerous to see it also being amplified. The kind of disinformation sphere that we're living in get amplified by leaders of tech companies themselves, because essentially what they're doing is using their stature as supposedly men of privilege who have access to the world's sort of digital archive and are supposedly masters of being able to both navigate it and sort of speak for it authoritatively. What they're doing when they continue to promulgate this information is essentially to try and speak for the kind of record of an online information sphere. And as we can see with Musk's own policies on the X platform, on Twitter, and his removal of any kind of checks and balances on disinformation, his leaning on to other tech companies such that they too now have removed or are in the process of removing essentially disinformation teams and dissolving safety and security teams for users, so that essentially any version of monstrous speech, whether it's hate speech or outright disinformation that could threaten young users, vulnerable users, older users, etc., any of that can go. And right, it resets a kind of record around what counts as sort of, again, just the empirical world and who gets to speak for the empirical world. It absolutely is an attack on history that we're seeing now. It's a brilliant observation, John.
Yeah, I'm really interested in this dissemination of these kinds of ideas because we're seeing it in real time now. Because as soon as someone clicks send on any platform, it's out there, and you can read it and you can judge it for yourself and discuss it with others, and hopefully not share it around too much because you realize that where it's coming from might be a bad thing. How did these eugenicists disseminate their ideas in the early days of the eugenics movement
Oh, well, they
compared
were
to?
very, very effective initially amongst just working amongst themselves. So, I mean, this was promulgated by a very patrician elite. Francis Galton was the sort of founder of eugenics. The cousin of Charles Darwin came from, of course, elite upper class families in England, and was really took years to sort of find his cause and his identity. Was sort of thought of as a dilettante wanderer who was dipping his toe in meteorology, into colonial science and explorer science, in the 19th century, before he ended up figuring out that eugenics would end up being his cause. But once it really became a kind of lifelong version of evangelism for him. And he focused on initially, I mean, he was someone who was obsessed with counting and ended up founding a famed lab that ended up getting installed at University College London, his biometrics lab, that he had initially would architect into things like public fairs, so that he could essentially convince people to come in and have things like their size of their heads measured, the strength of their blow, the capacity of their lungs. Essentially, what he was trying to do was to datify human bodies. And he was quite interested in finding correlations, again, as I was mentioning, between human physical, moral, and mental fitness. And under his mind, he had thought that all of these things were directly correlated. He argued in his earliest treatises on eugenics, essentially that it should be possible to eugenically perfect society because we can predict who would be how to design and pre-design the kind of fittest a universe or a galaxy of geniuses, as he argued, by simply looking at who the well-born was, and you could, according to his arguments, numerically prove that the well-born bred more of the well-born, that genius and talent clustered amongst the elite, and that you can also supposedly also numerically prove that poverty, prostitution, proclivity to drink, laziness, all of these things also supposedly clustered more amongst the poor because the unfitness bred more unfitness. And he was quite convinced, again, that you should be able to predict and preordain how to make a fitter society, and was quite disdainful of democratic policies. And what we see now continue nowadays with techno-eugenicists is that they are literally offended to their deepest moral core of the notion of democratic governments and institutions of the welfare state, because they were convinced that it wasted resources on human populations that did not deserve to have the same rights that the privileged and that the elite had. From their point of view, it was unthinkable that we were wasting resources on public schools and public hospitals and institutions that were meant to invest in some version of equity amongst mankind, because mankind, from their point of view, was not equal, and that there was no point ever trying to invest in public schools because the well-born would never amount to anything. The unwell-born, the unfit, would never amount to anything. And you should really be, if you're trying to design the strongest society, you should only invest in the strongest and the best. And from their point of view, again, democratic institutions were beyond irresponsible. They were taking away resources from exactly the people who deserve them best or most. And you can see exactly that kind of program now at play in Elon Musk's and Donald Trump's re-architecting of US government, where it's not just sort of a de-architecting of democratic institutions, but literally a remaking of government such that resources end up getting shored up and channeled directly into the back pockets of the wealthiest, including obviously Elon Musk. I mean, there is no issue or question of conflict of interest here. That's not even, no oversight is being exercised in this at all. And from their point of view, that is exactly how the world should be ordered.
That datification of individuals, early eugenicists tried to sell that as you should want to be datified, right? Didn't they do that? And we're kind of hearing those same tones now where they're like,
oh, correct.
It's fine to give away your digital fingerprint or
Yes.
do facial recognition technology, as long, they're basically saying if you have nothing to hide, why worry?
That's right. So, when Galton would go out and do this sort of data collection at public fairs in England, he was able to collect thousands of data profiles on people because it was kind of an exercise of vanity in some ways, that he could sort of unlock for you the secret to your fitness. I mean, it's sort of appealing to people that you can datify yourself and essentially have an empirical record of why you are fitter than others or better than others. And so too, when American eugenicists were doing their work of trying to spread the word of eugenics and evangelize, the eugenic program to more than just elite scientific classes and lettered classes, which is initially how eugenics really saw itself as sort of spreading once again. But by the 19 teens, you didn't just have eugenic leaders, stationed literally. I mean, eugenics was taught at hundreds of American universities by the turn of the century. It was, led by the who's who of the elite, from Harvard University to the founding presidents of Harvard University to the founding president of Stanford University's David Starr Jordan, heads of cultural institutions, of corporations, Oliver Wendell Holmes, the first medical dean of the medical school of Harvard, to Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., the famed Supreme Court judge who ruled on the Buck versus Bell 1927 case that maintained the legal status of forced sterilization of the unfit in the U.S. All of these were examples of just the literal tip of the iceberg of who eugenicists were in the U.S. But by the 19 teens, they recognized that they to really grow their program, they couldn't just evangelize to the medical and scientific and research elite. They really needed to also get more general Americans, broader publics on board with this to execute a eugenic reprogramming of society. And so they would go out to fairs and set up museum exhibits and really try to, again, do this sort of messaging and outreach to much broader American publics. The ERO, the Eugenics Record Office, a well-funded institution at Cold Springs Harbor, that was one of multiple eugenics research organizations that were quite powerful and very effective at lobbying national government into passing different kinds of laws, including sterilization laws, as I mentioned, in more than 30 states. They were also up to the work of surveying American families, sort of trying to, again, create profiles and to datify profiles of the unfit. And so to do that for, of course, elite classes, under this kind of notion, again, that if we were able to really just create a kind of composite and identify where unfitness is born, if we can just sort of prove this, then we can really, and demonstrate this all through the numbers, then we can really start to create more of a predictive model for government, for states, etc. And they were quite convinced that with enough data, they would finally be able to sort of prove how a eugenic society and the laws of eugenics were already in play, but that if we didn't stop things like immigration and letting in this kind of open migration of the unfit coming in from Southern Europe, from Eastern Europe, from Asia and Latin America, that society would eventually degenerate. And so, they were quite convinced that with enough numbers, they would be able to show this. And the Eugenics Record Office was quite effective at collecting tens of thousands of profiles on American individuals and families, all to this effort. And people were, as you say, exactly willing to volunteer information for in some part because they were convinced that it sort of unlocked a kind of mirror into and credentialization of themselves as part of a better, well-informed information class and fitter individual. Yes, I mean, and one can ask whether or not the internet, in some ways, has been doing this through its own kind of echo chamber effect on populations today, really creating a kind of mechanism and technology to enable and to further justify a kind of segregation of communities that once thought of themselves as quite pluralist and able to embrace all versions of difference.
I was reading the other day. I can't remember which article it was. I'd have to go back and look, but I read the other day that Clearview AI has more biometrics on Americans than the FBI does.
Yeah.
And that really was a moment where I had to step away from what I was reading and like, okay, hold on a second.
Yeah.
that's for real. And I'm like, okay, now I got to think about this in a whole different context with
That's right.
the idea of biometrics and datafication of people being placed in these avenues, because that's just a whole different realm of thinking about the world around us.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. Companies like Clearview are essentially just scraping without many, again, without oversight or without any sort of pushback to prevent them from doing that. Unlike the government, which can only do that again unless in the cases where it has some version of like direct suspicion. But generally, states aren't interested and aren't able to have the same. Democratic states have not had that practice of essentially just creating the largest data troves and profiles on people to the extent that they possibly, with this kind of logic of let's take in as much data as we possibly can, unlike tech companies who literally are scraping so much data that, I mean, they've now become challenged, of course, for different kinds of copyright violations from other companies and from other entities that say that that data actually is not even theirs.
You highlight the concept of data pluralism, and I'm all about telling people, hey, there are different ways to resist certain things. It's not one thing is the only way to resist over another. It's resistance together to predatory data, to whatever the case may be. Uh, you also brought up the Hull House, which I think a lot of people forget about or they haven't heard of as being this kind of data pluralism in its scope. Can you explain what the Hull House has done in previous years
Yeah.
to allow that to occur?
I mean, if folks don't remember what Hull House was, it was a really interesting model of essentially a research infrastructure that was based outside of universities. Hull House was founded in the 1890s and was really an alternative community of women and immigrant researchers who did not find a footing in the traditional academy, and for various reasons wanted to be or needed to be anchored instead in these kinds of alternative research sites. Hull House was based in the 19th Ward in Chicago, and it was working at a time when, of course, social Darwinism and eugenic models of social science were the dominant ones in place that essentially blamed the poor for their own kinds of failures. So it was either biology or some version of bad decision making that again was a sort of exhibit of your own mental, moral, or physical unfitness that made you poor, and you were to blame for your own the failure of your own economic well-being, was really again a sort of all pinned around the individual. Hull House really tried to turn that model on its head and insisted instead that it was structural, and that they too were convinced they could datify this, and they effectively did, to be able to demonstrate, essentially as they did by seeding a research network in the 19th Ward of Chicago, to demonstrate that families in the 19th Ward were not poor because of some sort of biological unfitness or because they were making bad decisions, but because wages were being systematically driven down. And where they were documenting essentially what that looked like, how exploitation worked and functioned in sweatshop districts, and how that impacted the lives of the working poor. That sweatshop owners were very happy and able to hire any version of worker, including workers who were as young as 2 and 3 years old. That there were various kinds of course, physical deformities that they were also quite willing to stomach and live with. So the kinds of deformities that you would see for young people and old people were evidences, in fact, of them having worked in sweatshops, what living conditions looked like that fostered unhealth. So again, unhealth was not a choice that people were making, but in fact, living in crowded conditions where there was no ventilation, or even working in spaces and working in factories where people were being exposed to dangerous chemicals and toxic chemicals, were all what was driving forms of unhealth. Poverty was cycling itself over and over again, not because of poor decision making, but because people's wages were being systematically driven down and kept down, because of the kind of documentation in the surveys, and the effective empirical uses of data that the Hull House researchers, again, largely women and immigrants, we're up to, they managed to change labor law in the US, seating in Illinois some of the first 8-hour workdays, anti child labor laws, getting that then modeled for national passage later. And the Hull House alumni went on to also lead a whole range of other institutions, from the National Consumers League to help co founding the NAACP, the Progressive Party, the researchers went on to also work and lead in the Illinois Bureau of Labor and Statistics. I mean, any number of different institutions that were working essentially to build new systems of oversight to protect uh, um, vulnerable populations and to enforce different kinds of safety standards and practices. Any number of alumni from Hull House really continued to use their history from that space and carry it on into other institutions afterwards.
So I've been speaking a lot with students and colleagues and such about data literacy, critical thinking, stuff like this when we're talking about being on these platforms and just discussing certain things. I've found that a lot of the students who I lead in seminar will tell me I get my news from TikTok, and I'm like, okay, well, let's talk about this, and we'll talk about it for 30 minutes and talk about digital literacy and this basically fight for truth or whatever you think truth is according to some people. What's some things that you would say to students who are wanting to learn more about just being digitally literate in this era when we have this underlying tone of predatory data and people who really make a lot of money off of predatory data and are spitting out a lot of disinformation to a lot of different people? What kind of things would you say to students nowadays when it comes to this kind of thing?
Be critical and look for your sources and look where things are coming from. I think the sort of lessons of like practicing like a good historian, looking for provenance, again, considering who your sources are, recognizing that not all sources are equal. Joe Rogan is not the same as the New York Times. To of course be careful about all that, and to recognize that sometimes the sort of easiest the places where it's easiest to find information and data is not necessarily does not necessarily mean it's the best source of
Mhm.
that information. To also take some time. I mean, even we are living in very polarized times, and the way that our information architectures are designed are to continue to simplify and to work against pluralism, to reduce our identities to a category A or to a category B. We have to be either a Democrat or a Republican. We have to be either some version of progressive or conservative. And our information streams become increasingly polarized across those very reductive categories, when, of course, people's information literacies and their profiles before might have been quite diverse and pluralized. We're not all just one thing. And even when we are that thing, we're not by default the most extreme um, radicalized version of that thing. But because the internet wants to sort of keep us on these platforms, want to keep us on their platforms as long as possible, they will continue to feed us information that looks more and more radical according to what the category of that reductive category of that thing is, without letting you see or understand that there's a much more nuanced conversation that's happening in between. And so to just be aware and to not just don't take for granted that the information is that you're finding online is the end all and be all of things. Have conversations with people and recognize, that again, when you're having political debates, your caricature of who that the other person is, a Republican or Democrat that's supposed to be sitting across the table from you. It's not just some sort of online literal caricature, but instead there are real people who have way more complicated political opinions than everyone buying into Trump, or everyone wanting to I don't know, do the opposite. you know
Right. Yeah. Generalizations are a dangerous thing, is what I tell them when I'm talking to them in history class. And I'm like, we might want to think about that in the modern sense too.
yeah,
But,
I
you
mean,
know,
we have gotten to this place essentially by Americans wanting to lean into, essentially the notion of trying to make eggs cheaper, not because people wanted to break down government or because wanted to elect Donald Trump king, or Elon Musk king. None of those. And so all the version of usurpation of political power and the breakdown of democratic institutions was not what either of these individuals was brought into the White House for. And so just to again be willing to again lean into some more human conversations and not take for granted that that the most extreme versions of what we're seeing play out, in information spheres is actual reality.
Anita, as we wrap up, I have to ask this because I've spoken with some students who are going into game development and they're in the tech scene and everything else involved with that on the digital humanities front. They may become exposed to some red flags that maybe they don't realize they're red flags. Is there anything from your research or previous research that you would want to highlight for those kinds of students who are going into that field?
You mean who are specifically going into like digital professions and
Yeah,
uh,
like the tech field in general, or
yeah,
something
yeah,
to that.
yeah, yeah. I mean, the tech field is becoming more and more, I would say, uh, there's a conversation that's happening on various campuses around what the future of tech should be and should look like. And students, I would say, and underscoring for your students, you have a lot of say and a lot of power, and being able to demand a different kind of data science. In many ways, the fact that we have data science programs architected all across the country and all across North America that don't do more in terms of teaching ethics than essentially just making it one class, or that think about the course in the humanities as sort of just like a one-off course that you can fit into your curriculum and that should be it. um, the the kind of internet that we have now and the sort of deeply eugenicist version of AI that is getting promulgated, and datification models that are getting promulgated. The notion that the very everyday, now ordinary fact that the architects of today's internet have essentially just made it the largest platform for real time experimentation and a constant A/B testing on human populations that we have in the world. None of this should be okay. And yet, of course, we've now made it quite mundane. And the reason why it is because we've really detached in most of the North and in the West, detached any kind of real grounding in critical humanities and social sciences with tech education and practice. Your average data science student has no idea that a eugenicist was behind the kind of the foundation method, statistical regression, was founded by Francis Galton because he was obsessed that his own white patrician class would degenerate with increased globalization and increased immigration and new diversifying populations in cities. He was obsessed with trying to keep that from happening. And statistical regression, amongst the many other forms of eugenic methodologies, composite portraiture, new ways of sort of designing criminal data banks, etc. All of this was coming out of, again, this kind of scientific, quote unquote, scientific methodology came out of his eugenic anxieties and paranoia. They can't be separated. But very few if any, of my undergraduates knew that or recognized that, certainly at the time that I was writing the book. And I hope a few of them at least do now.
Well, they have no excuse. It's an open access book, and everyone listening should read it as well. Remember to go to University of California Press, get a copy of Predatory Data, Eugenics and Big Tech, and Our Fight for an Independent Future. Anita, I do thank you so much for your time. I'm so glad that we could have the opportunity to chat about this.
Great. Thanks as well, John.